We're going to talk about the Tower of Babel, but I want to talk about it in a way that the way many scholars look at it is it's not just a story about how we came about with different languages, but it's a story of governance and people. We're free to come into a church to worship God, but think about China, right? What's happening in China today is they're continually trying to shut down churches. Now, part of that is because it's a communist government, and communist governments are totalitarian in nature. That means we know all things that need to be known. And if you have a God above you that's transcendent, the implication is there's something I don't know. So what do you try to do in a communist country? Get rid of God, because that's the implication is there's somebody who knows more than us. You have a communist government in China. We'll get back to that later in the presentation. But we need to be praying for all governments in the world, because the tendency is man believes he can be in charge of everything. And we'll see as we go deep into the Tower of Babel, the message about how man behaves and governance. So we are going to take a look at the Tower of Babel. Now that's a deviation from Mark, but I mentioned last week when we looked at this, we looked at the structure and how we read the Bible. And that very often there's something underneath, right? So we read at the surface level, and we're not often taught to say, there might be more going on underneath. This, the Tower of Babel, is a masterpiece of all of these things going on underneath the text. So for instance, you have literary devices. We'll talk about that in the Tower of Babel, plus they're all over the Bible. Wordplay in Hebrew, there's a lot of wordplay, words that sound alike or spelled alike, and they're used all over the place. You'll see that in the Tower of Babel. And then, of course, symbolism, the symbolism that's going on underneath the text. So that's what we talked about last week. We're going to do the same thing today, and I just wanted to show you, it's such a great, rich, short, it's only 9 verses, example of all of this. Okay, so everyone turn in your Bible, chapter 11, Genesis 11, verse 1. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. And they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so that they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it is called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So the first thing, and this is on your notes, is there's a structure to these 9 verses. I'm going to give you 2 names of how you describe the structure. The first one, which is on the screen, is the Hebrew way of describing it, and they call it At-Bash. Now, where do they get At-Bash from? Well, Aleph is the first letter of the Hebrew Bible, and Tav, the T, is the last letter. So you have the first, then the last. Then you go to the B, the Bet, that's the second letter of the alphabet, and the Shin is the second to last. So you have first to last, second to last, and then you would keep going. Third to last, fourth to last. So you're building a structure with the sentences. So let me give you a visual of what this would look like. So if this were the 9 verses, and you said, well, the top one up here is going to coincide with the bottom one down there. So that's the At. Aleph at the top, Tav at the bottom. The second verse is going to coincide with verse 8. The third verse is going to coincide with verse 7. So notice, come let us make bricks, and down here it says, come let us go down and confuse. So they're matching each other. And this is intentionally done. This one will match that one, and then you get one sentence in the very middle, and that becomes the turning point. And so what's the sentence? Well, it's when God shows up. You've got something happening on the first half of the story. God shows up, and the whole thing inverts. And that's going to be the main theme, is something about an inversion. What they thought they were doing in the beginning gets flipped over on its head, and they end up scattered and in chaos. But the turning point, now, not every structure like this always has an odd number so that you get one sentence. They don't all turn in the same way, but when you see the structures, you tend to find similarities. So, okay, now the Hebrew, at bash, you don't need to remember that, but for those of you keeping score, that's what it is. In Greek, and this is what most people know it as, is a chiasm, or chiastic structure. Now the letter chi in Greek is an X. So they notice, well, if we take away these two sides of the X, we've got something that looks like an arrow, right? And if we build the same structure out, you get verse 1 up here compares to verse 1b at the bottom. Verse 2, verse 2, verse 3, verse 3, like that. That's a chiastic structure. So it's got a arrow pointing like nature to it. All right, so the first part, I mentioned this, the first part, verse 1 through 4, is all man. As we go through each sentence, which we will in a minute, you'll notice that it's all has to do with what men say we're going to go out and do. Verse 5, the turning point is God shows up. And then, what happens when God shows up? Well, man's plans suddenly don't go the way that they expected them to. And so you have this structure that says it's all men on the top, God shows up, and then everything inverts as God starts acting with them. So what I want to do is compare verse 1 to 9, then 2 to 8, 3 to 7. We're going to go in that order. So if you look at verse 1, you have this phrase, the whole earth. And then if you go down to verse 9, the sentence ends with the phrase, the whole earth. Now, one of my frustrations with our Bible translators is sometimes, like my Bible says the whole world. If you look at maybe 20 different versions, the first sentence will often be very different. Because in English we think, well, that's too much repetition. So let's change it from earth to world. But then you miss the whole structure. You miss the fact that, wait a minute, that it says the whole earth in Hebrew, so why not say it in English? But our translators kind of they don't want us to get bored. Okay, so the whole earth and the whole earth. Verse 2. We notice in verse 2, man is attempting to settle. Now we're going to go over these in more detail. So man attempts to settle. What's the inversion of settling somewhere? Being scattered, right? So when we go down to verse 8 down here, God scatters them. So it's the inversion of what they're attempting to do. Verse 3, God makes a speech. Man makes a speech. And man says, we're going to go create something. The inversion of that, verse 7, is there's a divine speech that says, nope, sorry. You're going to be confused. And it's one of the coolest things, word plays in the Bible is right there. When we get there, how they show that inversion is really amazing. Okay, verse 4, and this will become important in a minute, we'll see. They're trying to build a tower to the heavens. So what is man always attempting to do? Be like God. So they're attempting to go cross a boundary, and God says, verse 6 is, We can't let them cross into the heavens, so we're going to have to go down and do something. Man is always attempting to cross a boundary to become like God. And then, of course, the last one, God, verse 5, is the center point where God enters that situation. All right, let's look a little bit closer. So here's verse 1. Now notice I had to put earth because mine says world, but that's okay. So verse 1, now the whole earth had one language and a common speech. Compare that to verse 9. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So you have the whole earth compared to the whole earth. So that gives you an idea that they're repeating something. Now, there's an interesting comment. This was from a rabbi who lived in Russia in the 1800s. And he's reading this verse 1. And it says, there was one language and a common speech. Now, all of us budding Bible scholars, when you see something that looks redundant, you ask the question, why? Couldn't they have just stopped? The whole earth had one language? Because if the story is simply about the dividing up, the confusing of languages, well, you could have stopped right here. It's important. So what's this mean then? And his answer was, this is the first example of a totalitarian state. Now remember, the guy's living in Russia, and he's watching what's happening with the czars in Russia and speech. Not just do we have the same language, we all speak English. Are you required to have the same speech? Who's controlling your speech? Well, in a totalitarian government, who controls your speech? The government. So if you're in Russia, are you allowed to complain? No, because that would acknowledge, yeah, only once do you complain. Because that would glaringly show there's a flaw in their utopia. So you must have the same speech. Now, why is our First Amendment of the United States freedom of speech? And who's it really, who's it protecting us from? When they wrote that, very first, our founding fathers wrote the First Amendment. From the government, yeah, not from each other. You don't protect speech from each other. You protect it from the government stepping in. Because England would have said, you're not allowed to say those things. So it's an interesting comment that this could be, you could extrapolate from this, something that man's tendency is that we will govern all people and tell you how to think. And therefore your speech is the outcome to that. Now, notice something else. I just want to point this out. That they're also building a tower that reaches to the heavens. So where have we, if we were just reading our Bible from the very first time, where have we heard the phrase, the heavens and earth? Where did we hear that first? Genesis 1. God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this little section of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, is its own little section. Because the very next chapter is when Abraham shows up. And that really now starts the whole idea of Israel. So chapters 1 through 11 are almost like a prehistory. And so what you get in the beginning, right, this little section starts with heavens and the earth, and it ends with heavens and the earth. Then what you get is God, as he's creating the heavens and the earth, he's separating them, right? There's a Psalm 115 says, the heavens are God's, and he gave the earth to man. Meaning there's a boundary. And if we want to bring those boundaries together, if we want to cross them, then you have to follow God's way, not your own. So, in a sense, God places a boundary between heaven and earth. So what's this story about? What are they trying to do? Cross a boundary, yeah. And the moment God says, stay in your lane, you human beings, every time you think you're going to start becoming like a god, things are going to collapse on you. So be humble and be a human being. You're not God. God is God. We're humans. So there's an interesting theme of boundary crossing going on. Okay, so that was verse 1. So we got the heavens and the earth, or we got the earth, the whole earth, and then there's an idea of crossing into the heavens. So verse 2, it says, as the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar. I'll show you that in a minute. And they settled there. So what's the inversion of settling? Well, we've already talked about that. If we go down to the counterpart in verse 8, you've got the Lord scattered them over the whole earth. So what was their intention? To settle and be one people. And God said, yeah, when you planned on your own, the end result might not be what you thought it was going to be. Okay, now I want to show you this right here. Where is Shinar? So let me show you. So here's a map of the Middle East. This is the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Egypt. This is the Persian Gulf. This is modern-day Iran. And here's modern-day Iraq. And you can see right here the city of Babylon. So Jerusalem is on this side. The Fertile Crescent does this because you can't walk across that desert. So you have to follow the rivers to get to Babylon. So the plains of Shinar are right here. Now if you went there today, it might look something like this. This was during the invasion in 2003, and I took this picture of the other helicopter that was with us, and we're flying north along the Euphrates River. But notice how flat it is. It's just flat as a pancake. Two major rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and they flood regularly. So you get a giant floodplain that cuts through. So there is a plain in Shinar. They've got all these canals now with the Euphrates, but this is one of the canals off the Euphrates. But you can just see how flat the land is. It's as flat as a pancake. So when the Bible says there was a plain in Shinar, it's literally, there's a plain. What you see here, I'll show you some close-ups. This is the ancient city of Babylon. When they excavated it, it wasn't built up like this. Saddam Hussein had a great plan. He was going to rebuild Babylon. So what you see, all these walls, Saddam tried to rebuild it. I'm telling you, Saddam is a perfect example of the Tower of Babel because, first of all, Babylon is in Iraq, and he was attempting to create, as a dictator, this piece of utopia, but it was utter chaos. So this is Babylon. I'll show you a couple pictures in a minute, but I want you to notice something. First of all, it's as flat as a pancake, so if you want to get anything up in the air, you have to build your own mountain, which is what the Tower of Babel is. It's building a mountain that goes up to the heavens. And this is one of Saddam's 75 palaces. And you notice he built a hill. Because what does it say to the surrounding people? I am above you. Look up and you see me. Apparently, from what I understand, he never actually stayed in this. So he was a little too paranoid to stay in his own palace. So when we were staying at Babylon, we would walk at night and go watch the sunset from his palace. There were all kinds of Marines living inside of here. They just took over. That's a closer up picture. I tried to get it. It's a little fuzzy, but so Saddam built a little mountain. Now, what do they build with in Babylon, even till today? Bricks. And there are brick making factories all up and down the rivers. Still laying the bricks out in the sun, donkeys pulling carts. It's not very advanced. This is the inside, this is the actual walls from Nebuchadnezzar's time, and that's a brick. I don't know if I've showed you guys this before, but yeah, this is a dedication brick from Nebuchadnezzar, dedicating the walls of Babylon. But you can tell it's all brick, and that's pretty amazing that these bricks have lasted 2,500, 800 years. It's pretty amazing. And that they inlaid in these bricks are these very complex animals. I mean, that's not posted onto the brick. That's part of the brick. It's pretty amazing. The Bible is getting all of this correct, right? So the data is correct. Now let's talk about this inversion that's going to happen. And this is really, these two sentences are amazing. By the way, if you wanted some further commentary on this, a great book, this is by Jonathan Sacks, who's a rabbi. He was the chief rabbi of Great Britain. But if you want to learn about Genesis or any of the first 5 books, read him. It's so deep, you can only read like one teeny chapter at a time, and then your brain has to take a break. So let's see what this says. So verse 3, they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks," right? "And bake them thoroughly." So we saw those bricks in Babylon. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Now, if we look at the opposing sentence, verse 7, how does it start? "Come, let us," right? So they're repeating that phrase, "go down and confuse." This is the coolest thing. It's a wordplay that is an inversion itself. This phrase, "let us make bricks," is all crammed into one word in Hebrew. But the root of it is this: a lamed, a vet, and a nun. So LVN. And when you get down to this phrase, "come let us confuse," notice the word. NVL. It's a perfect inversion of this one. And so that wordplay shows you what's actually happening. So the tool you use. Now, one example of that. What was the big news this week that had to do with money? There was a big Powerball, right? Over like $1 billion. When someone starts to play the Powerball, what do they think the money's going to do for them? Make them rich, make life easy. Everything's going to go into order. Yes, and what happens often to someone who wins the lottery? They descend into chaos. So the tool that you thought was going to bring you order, the bricks, inverts and brings chaos, confusion. This is everywhere in life. Okay, so the bricks and confuse. But that's a wordplay, and that wordplay is so powerful to show you what's actually going on. So now check this out. Verse 4 says, "Come, let us build ourselves, and we're going to make a name for ourselves." What's missing in those little God? So what happens to human beings when they set out in their own power, their own ideas, their own planning, their own everything? If you don't bring God, then you don't know if what you're doing is going to actually create order or chaos. Now, what if they had said, "Okay, we're all going to pray, and God, you be in charge, and you tell us what to do and direct our steps." Well, then whatever they did would have created order, because God directs you into order, not confusion. And you can see what's so interesting. This is one of the principles that I put on your sheet is they're trying to make a name for themselves, right? So that we won't be scattered. And now the name that they've made for themselves, Babel, thousands of years later, we still use the word Babel to describe confusion and chaos. So they did make a name for themselves. It was just the opposite. Right, that's the whole story is you're creating something and it's the opposite of what you intended to do. That human beings are doing that all day long. And this is a bit of humor, right? There's a little tongue-in-cheek here. So they thought, we just built a 300-foot tower and it's going into heaven. And how does God respond? Yeah, hold on a second. Let me come down there and take a look. Yeah, you're not even close to getting into heaven. A 300-foot tower. So God says, let me drop down to your level and examine what you've done. So there's a bit of humor in that central verse that they're not even close to getting into heaven. It's all about human behavior and what happens when humans set out to try to do something either without God or create something that often ends up in chaos. So they're going to make a name for themselves, and of course that name is Babel. It ends in chaos. So I was trying to think of some things in life that we can all identify with today that might follow this pattern for many people. Yep, the lotto is one. People who think, here's the tool that's going to bring order and create a name for myself. I'm going to be wealthy and live at ease. And the next thing you know, they're down in chaos and they can't figure out why. Because it's a confusing thing. You won millions of dollars, but now you're bankrupt. That doesn't make any sense. What about this place? Now they have a PR department too. For every star that we see at the award show, there's 1,000 people who have attempted to make it and very often end up with a destroyed life. They don't want to show you the underbelly of Hollywood. I'm going to go make a name for myself by leaving my farm in Kansas to Hollywood, and the next thing you know, your life is cratering because you don't know what you stepped into. And when I saw this picture, I thought, this is perfect because it's an inversion, right? How many times do governments say, we're going to create a program that's going to do X, Y, and Z, and the program ends up doing something completely different? I mean, that's just natural because people in government think that they can write rules down and that will just magically apply to everybody else and everything turns to order. So governments are always the worst offenders when it comes to this, which is why so many people read the Tower of Babel and say, this is about governance. Because governments are the ones that are always, throughout history, trying to build something or project. Even the Roman Empire, when we talked about Caesar, Caesar said, I'm the savior because look what I can do. And the reality was, there was still chaos everywhere. The last one, we'll be wrapping it up here, is this. I meant to bring a book with me. There's a great book called Tombstone. Tombstone is written by a guy who's actually still in the Communist Party. They let him stay there. In an interview one time someone said, why do they let you stay in the Communist Party? And he said, well, it's kind of like a reminder that if you let your excesses go too much, the people are going to revolt and they're going to come get you. So I'm there as their reminder to not go too excessive. And the book is called Tombstone. And he wrote it as a tombstone to his father who died of starvation. And to his estimate, the other 36 million people that died of starvation. There was a program called The Great Leap Forward. How does that sound? It's progressive, it sounds great, we're going to take a great leap forward. How many people died during that? Does anyone know? I just said the number. I said an estimate. So the Chinese government puts the estimate at 15 million. But anybody who studies it puts it anywhere from 30 to 45 million. Now that's a huge bracket of millions of people. So the gentleman who wrote the book Tombstone puts it at 36 million people died of starvation. And if you complained about you were hungry, you were killed. In a 3-year period, 1959 through 61. They were trying to create utopia, and it ends up in chaos. So Russia, the same thing with a communist government. And I've heard this, I can't verify it. In Venezuela, there were babies dying of starvation, so they made a law that the doctors can't put down starvation as the cause of death. You're going to control the speech, right? So you force a doctor to lie, and what happens? Well, the statistics of babies dying of starvation go way down because you're not allowed to put that in. So this is what I think that the Tower of Babel is warning against. And of course, these, throughout history, you can find these. Heck, I hate to say it, the Christian church in Europe in the Middle Ages tried to bring about the kingdom of heaven, and they killed hundreds of thousands of people doing it and destroyed Europe. So we're not immune from it. We have to be cautious of it. Okay, so from Genesis 1 to Genesis 11, in Genesis 1, God creates the order out of the chaos, right? So God is the one creating the order. The moment God creates the order and man steps in, what happens? Yeah, it goes right back into chaos. So God brings order from chaos. That's Genesis 1 through and verse 2. Man brings order, turns it back into chaos. Genesis 11, man is intending to create order. We're gonna bring our people together in one speech. We're gonna not be dispersed. And of course, without God, chaos ensues, and now the legacy that they left behind is Babel, confusion. When man attempts to be more than human, quickly end up being less than human. Now, all of that is built into the structure. So notice, if you just do a surface reading, you kind of get the idea that God's going to scatter and confuse the languages. But if you know all the structure that's underlying that, the chiasm, the inversion that's going on, the wordplay, there's a number of other ones that I just didn't even mention. They're all in there, and they're all telling you the same thing. That this is what often happens to humankind when they attempt to set out and do something that's not in the order of the way God would do something.
We pray that this teaching has helped you explore the depths of the biblical text. If you've been impacted by this video, be sure to click the like button on YouTube and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive notifications when we post our latest videos. You can also impact the lives of others in your community by sharing this teaching on Facebook. For more teachings which explore the depths of the biblical text, go to our website at figtreeteaching.com.